Dad is gone. It's time for you to leave." Those were the words my stepson said to me at the dinner table just 3 days after we buried my husband. I remember every detail of that moment. The soft glow of the chandelier above us. The untouched slice of apple pie sitting on my plate. The rain tapping gently against the kitchen windows. Everything looked normal. Everything felt familiar. And yet, in a single sentence, the family I thought I belonged to disappeared. My name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 72 years old, and until that evening, I believed I still had a place in the home my husband and I shared for nearly 3 decades. William Parker wasn't just my husband. He was my best friend. We met later in life after both of us had already experienced heartbreak. We built something steady together. Something quiet. Something real. When he passed away unexpectedly at 76, I thought the hardest part would be learning how to wake up each morning without him. I was wrong. The hardest part was discovering what some people had been waiting for. The dining room felt strangely empty that night. William's chair sat untouched at the head of the table. No one had moved it since the funeral. I found myself glancing toward it every few minutes, almost expecting to see him sitting there with his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Ethan sat across from me. His arms were folded tightly against his chest. Vanessa stared at her phone for most of the meal. Neither of them had spoken much since arriving. I assumed grief affected everyone differently. I wanted to believe that. Then Ethan cleared his throat. He placed a thick folder on the table and slid it toward the center. "We need to talk about the house," he said. The words felt cold, practical, out of place. I looked at him carefully. "What about it?" I asked. Vanessa finally looked up. Her expression was unreadable. "We think it's best if you start making arrangements," she said. "Arrangements?" I repeated. Ethan nodded. "Dad's gone. The house is too much for one person. We figured you'd probably want something smaller." I looked around the room. The room William had painted himself. The room where we hosted Christmas dinners, birthday parties, and quiet Sunday breakfasts. Every wall held a memory. Every corner carried part of our story. "This is my home," I said softly. Ethan's jaw tightened. It was Dad's home. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced at the funeral. Vanessa reached for her glass of water. "Nobody wants to make this difficult," she said. "We're just trying to be realistic." Realistic. I had heard that word before. People used it whenever they wanted to justify something painful. I lowered my eyes to my folded hands. They were trembling slightly, though I wasn't sure whether it was from sadness or disbelief. After everything William and I built together, after all those years, they were discussing my future as if I were an inconvenience that needed to be managed. Ethan pushed the folder closer. "You should start looking at options soon." I didn't open it. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Instead, I quietly picked up my coffee cup and took a sip. The coffee had already gone cold. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, something else settled over me. Not anger, not fear. Something calmer, something sharper. For the first time all evening, I noticed that neither Ethan nor Vanessa seemed sad. They seemed confident, certain, as if the outcome had already been decided. I stood slowly from my chair. "If you'll excuse me," I said. Neither of them tried to stop me. I walked upstairs to the bedroom William and I had shared. His sweater still hung on the back of the closet door. His watch still rested on the dresser. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared into the darkness. Then I remembered something William had said years ago during a conversation I barely thought about at the time. He had smiled and squeezed my hand. "You'll never have to worry, Evelyn," he told me. At that moment, I didn't know exactly what he meant. But the next morning, I decided I was going to find out. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then I looked toward William's side of the bed. The empty pillow brought reality back. The house was silent. No footsteps. No coffee brewing downstairs. No voice asking whether I wanted eggs or toast. Just silence. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to it. Grief had a strange way of changing familiar things. The same walls looked different. The same windows felt colder. Even the morning light seemed less welcoming than it used to. I made my way downstairs and started a pot of coffee. William had always said good decisions should never be made before the first cup. I smiled at the memory. It was one of the few smiles that felt genuine that week. As I waited for the coffee to brew, I looked around the kitchen. Every cabinet, every chair, every scratch on the hardwood floor told a story. William and I had chosen this house together 28 years earlier. It was not the biggest house on the street, but it felt right the moment we walked through the front door. We planted the maple tree in the front yard ourselves. We built the stone garden path one summer when we were both too stubborn to hire help. This was not simply property. It was a life. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat beside the window. Rain clouds still covered the sky. Across the street, a neighbor walked his dog. Normal life continued as if nothing had happened. I thought about Ethan and Vanessa. Their behavior at dinner had not appeared emotional. It had seemed planned. That realization bothered me more than their words. The folder Ethan placed on the table had not looked like something prepared overnight. It looked organized, deliberate, as though conversations had already taken place without me. I remembered small moments from the weeks before William passed away. Phone calls that suddenly ended when I entered a room. Conversations interrupted when I walked by. At the time, I blamed stress. Now I was not so sure. My eyes drifted toward the bookshelf near the fireplace. A framed photograph sat on the second shelf. William and I stood beside a lake during a vacation in Maine years ago. He had one arm around my shoulders. We looked happy, comfortable, secure. I picked up the frame and brushed away a thin layer of dust. Then another memory surfaced. About 5 years earlier, we had attended a dinner party hosted by close friends. The conversation turned to estate planning. One couple described a lengthy legal dispute involving relatives after a death in the family. Most people at the table looked uncomfortable. Not William. He simply nodded and said, "The easiest way to prevent problems is to make everything clear before problems start." I remembered teasing him for sounding like a lawyer. He laughed and squeezed my hand beneath the table. "Trust me," he said. "One day you will appreciate it." At the time, I barely paid attention. William handled most financial matters. Not because he excluded me, but because he enjoyed it. He read contracts for fun. He organized paperwork in perfectly labeled folders. He kept copies of everything. Suddenly, his words from years ago echoed in my mind. "One day you will appreciate it." I finished my coffee and looked toward the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was almost 9 o'clock. A feeling settled over me. Not certainty, not yet, but something close to it. William was many things. Careful was one of them. If he had promised I would never have to worry, then perhaps he had left something behind besides memories. Perhaps he had left protection. Perhaps he had anticipated exactly this situation. I stood, picked up my purse, and grabbed my car keys from the entry table. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt curiosity, and I intended to find answers. The drive into town took about 20 minutes. The roads were still damp from the rain, and low gray clouds hung over the Connecticut shoreline. I kept both hands on the steering wheel and tried to organize my thoughts. Part of me hoped I was overreacting. Perhaps Ethan and Vanessa had simply handled their grief poorly. Perhaps there was an explanation for the coldness that had settled over them. But another part of me remembered the confidence in their faces at dinner. They had not looked uncertain. They had looked prepared. I stopped at a red light and thought about the folder Ethan had placed on the table. He had never asked what I wanted. He had never asked how I was coping. His concern seemed focused entirely on the house. The realization left a bitter taste in my mouth. When the light changed, I continued toward the bank William and I had used for years. The building sat on a quiet corner near the town green. The same American flag waved outside. The same flower beds lined the entrance. Everything appeared unchanged. Inside, however, I felt different. For the first time in many years, I was walking into a financial meeting alone. A young employee greeted me and directed me to a private office. A few minutes later, an older banker named Richard entered. William and I had known him for nearly 15 years. His expression softened when he saw me. "Evelyn," he said gently. I was very sorry to hear about William. I thanked him and sat down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Richard opened a folder and adjusted his glasses. "What can I help you with today?" he asked. I hesitated before answering. "I am not entirely sure," I admitted. "I think I need to understand where things stand." Richard nodded. He seemed to understand immediately. Over the next half hour, he reviewed several accounts William and I shared. Some details were familiar, others were not. William had always handled the paperwork. As Richard explained various documents, a pattern began to emerge. William had organized everything carefully. Nothing appeared random. Nothing appeared unfinished. The more I listened, the more I recognized his fingerprints on every decision. Richard eventually leaned back in his chair. "William was one of the most prepared clients I have ever worked with," he said. He believed in planning ahead. I looked down at the polished wooden desk. That sounded exactly like him. Before leaving, I asked one final question. Did William ever express concerns about family disputes after his death? Richard paused. It was only a second, but I noticed it. He believed clarity prevented disputes, Richard replied carefully. That was important to him. Important. There was that word again. By the time I stepped back outside, the clouds had started to break apart. Sunlight slipped through small openings in the sky. I sat in my car, but did not start the engine immediately. Instead, I stared through the windshield and thought about everything I had learned. William had not been careless. He had not left loose ends. If that was true, then there were answers somewhere. Real answers. As I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed a name I had not expected to see. Michael Harrison, William's attorney. I had met him several times over the years. He rarely called without a reason. I answered immediately. Hello, Michael. His voice sounded calm and professional. Evelyn, I have been trying to reach you. There are several documents we need to discuss. My grip tightened slightly on the phone. What kind of documents? I asked. There was a brief pause. Then he said something that made my heart skip a beat. Documents William wanted reviewed very carefully after his passing, including the prenuptial agreement. For a moment, I said nothing. I had not heard anyone mention that agreement in years. Almost nobody ever talked about it. Michael continued, I think it would be best if we met as soon as possible. As I listened, a strange feeling settled over me. For days, I had felt lost. For days, I had felt as though the ground beneath my feet was shifting. But now, for the first time, I sensed that William had left behind more than memories. He had left a plan. And somewhere inside that plan was the truth Ethan and Vanessa seemed so certain did not exist. The meeting with Michael was scheduled for the following afternoon. That gave me nearly 24 hours to think, which was both a blessing and a burden. The more time I had, the more memories surfaced. Some were comforting. Others felt different now that I viewed them through a new lens. When William and I first became engaged, he insisted we have several difficult conversations before the wedding. At the time, I thought he was simply being cautious. He had worked hard his entire life. He owned property. He had investments. He had responsibilities. I respected that. One evening, we sat together on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. That was when he first mentioned legal planning. I remember laughing and telling him that discussing paperwork was not exactly romantic. He laughed too. Then he said something I never forgot. Love and preparation are not opposites, Evelyn. The people who care about each other plan ahead. Back then, I saw those conversations as practical necessities. Nothing more. But now, years later, his words carried a different weight. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the house of my closest friend, Carol Whitmore. We had known each other for more than 30 years. She opened the door before I even reached the porch. One look at my face, and she knew something was wrong. We sat in her kitchen drinking tea while I explained everything that had happened since the funeral. Carol listened quietly. She never interrupted. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and shook her head slowly. Something about this does not sound right, she said. You think so too? I asked. She gave me a look that almost made me smile. Evelyn, I have known you for decades. William adored you. He would not have left you vulnerable. Her confidence stayed with me long after I left her house. On the drive home, I thought about Ethan and Vanessa again. Looking back, the changes had not happened overnight. There had been signs. Small ones. Easy to dismiss at the time. Ethan used to call every week. Then the calls became monthly. Vanessa once asked detailed questions about the value of the house during a family barbecue. At the time, I assumed she was making conversation. Now I wondered if there had been another reason. By evening, I found myself standing in William's home office. I had avoided the room since his passing. Everything remained exactly where he left it. The desk was spotless. Pens sat neatly inside a wooden holder. File folders were arranged with military precision along a shelf behind the desk. I ran my fingers lightly across the polished surface and remembered how many evenings he spent there reviewing documents. Not because he distrusted people, because he believed preparation created peace. My eyes stopped on a framed photograph near the corner of the desk. It showed William smiling beside me at our 25th wedding anniversary celebration. Looking at that picture, I suddenly realized something important. Throughout our marriage, William rarely made promises he could not keep. If he told me I would be protected, then he had almost certainly taken steps to ensure it. That thought stayed with me as darkness settled outside the windows. For the first time since Ethan placed that folder on the dinner table, fear began to lose its grip. I still did not know what Michael was going to show me. I still did not know what the documents contained. But deep down, I no longer felt like someone waiting to be pushed out of her own life. I felt like someone standing on the edge of a truth that had been carefully preserved for exactly this moment. The following afternoon arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze coming in from the coast. I left the house earlier than necessary. I had never enjoyed being late, and on that day, I needed a few extra minutes to gather myself. Michael Harrison's office occupied the second floor of a red brick building overlooking the town green. William and I had visited there many times over the years. Walking through the front door felt strangely familiar, almost as if I were stepping into a conversation William had started long ago and expected me to finish. The receptionist greeted me warmly and guided me to a conference room. A large window overlooked the street below. People moved through their day carrying coffee cups and shopping bags. Their lives continued normally, while mine felt suspended between the past and whatever came next. A few moments later, Michael entered carrying a thick leather folder. He shook my hand and offered a sympathetic smile. "Thank you for coming, Evelyn," he said. I nodded. "I have a feeling this meeting is important." He sat across from me and folded his hands on the table. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he opened the folder. "Before we discuss specific documents," he said, "there is something you should understand." William was extremely thorough. He anticipated questions. He anticipated disagreements. He wanted to make certain his intentions could not be misunderstood. Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of comfort. They sounded exactly like the man I married. Michael removed several documents and arranged them carefully. Every page contained notes, signatures, and dates. Nothing looked rushed. Nothing looked incomplete. It was clear that William had spent years making sure everything was properly documented. Many people assume estate planning begins after someone passes away, Michael continued. William approached it differently. He viewed it as an ongoing responsibility. I listened quietly. Each sentence reinforced what I already suspected. William had been preparing for this moment long before anyone imagined it would arrive. Then Michael slid a document toward me. The heading immediately caught my attention. Prenuptial agreement. I had not seen the document in years. In truth, I had almost forgotten about it. We signed it before our wedding because William believed clarity protected relationships. At the time, I trusted him completely and never gave the agreement much thought afterward. Michael adjusted his glasses and opened to a marked section. "There are provisions here that become very important under current circumstances," he said. My heartbeat quickened slightly. He began reviewing several pages, explaining language that seemed far more significant now than it had decades earlier. As he spoke, a picture slowly emerged. The agreement was not designed to create division. It was designed to prevent it. William had carefully outlined ownership rights, financial protections, and responsibilities. Every major asset had been addressed. Every possible source of confusion appeared to have been considered. I found myself staring at the pages in disbelief. Not because the information was shocking, but because of how comprehensive it was. This was not the work of someone who hoped things would work out. This was the work of someone determined to make sure they would. Michael eventually looked up from the document. "There is one more thing," he said. He reached into the folder and removed another sealed packet. Unlike the other paperwork, this one appeared personal. My name was written across the front in William's handwriting. For a moment, the room seemed to grow very still. I recognized those letters immediately. The slight curve of the W. The careful spacing between words. My throat tightened. Michael placed the packet gently in front of me. William instructed me to provide this only if certain situations arose after his passing. I stared at the envelope without touching it. Suddenly, every conversation, every promise, and every reassurance William had ever given me felt closer than ever before. Whatever answers I had been searching for, I sensed they were waiting inside that packet. And for the first time since the funeral, I realized I was no longer walking through uncertainty. I was walking toward the truth William had carefully protected all along. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the envelope. For a moment, I simply looked at it. The sight of William's handwriting brought back a flood of memories. Birthday cards left on the kitchen counter. Notes tucked into my suitcase before trips. grocery lists written with the same careful penmanship. Michael remained silent, giving me space. Finally, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The first line immediately brought tears to my eyes. Not because it was dramatic, because it sounded exactly like William. He wrote that if I was reading the letter, then he was no longer there to speak for himself. He said he hoped I would remember that every important decision he made had been guided by one principle: making sure I was safe. I continued reading slowly. William explained that he understood how families could change after a loss. Grief affected people differently. Money affected people differently as well. He wrote that neither emotion should determine my future. Then came a sentence I read twice. He stated that he had spent years ensuring that no one could pressure me out of my home or interfere with the life we built together. I looked up from the letter. Michael was watching quietly. He anticipated this? I asked. Michael nodded. More than you realize. He reached for another document and opened it to several marked pages. The legal language was complex, but the meaning was becoming increasingly clear. William had not relied on assumptions. He had relied on written agreements. Everything was documented. Everything was enforceable. Every major decision had been reviewed multiple times over the years. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because William had protected me. Sadness because he had apparently believed such protection might one day be necessary. As the meeting continued, Michael explained additional details. Certain assets had specific ownership structures. Certain rights were protected by agreements signed long ago. The house itself was addressed with extraordinary precision. William had left very little room for interpretation. When we finally concluded the meeting, nearly 2 hours had passed. I gathered the documents carefully and thanked Michael. Before I left, he offered one final piece of advice. Do not make any rushed decisions, he said, and do not allow anyone else to make them for you. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the windows of nearby buildings. The town looked brighter than it had in weeks. For the first time since the funeral, I did not feel like someone standing alone against uncertainty. I felt prepared. That evening, I returned home carrying the folder Michael had assembled. As I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed a moving truck parked along the curb. My stomach tightened. The truck was not there to remove my belongings. It was there because Ethan and Vanessa had already begun making plans of their own. Through the front window, I could see them sitting at the dining room table. Papers were spread across the surface. A real estate brochure rested beside a laptop computer. They looked busy, confident, certain. Neither of them knew where I had spent the afternoon. Neither of them knew what I had learned. As I walked through the front door, Ethan glanced up and smiled. It was the first smile I had seen from him in days. Something about it felt misplaced. Perfect timing, he said. Vanessa and I have been discussing next steps. I set my purse down calmly and removed my coat. Then I looked around the room that William and I had filled with decades of memories. For the first time, I was no longer intimidated by what might happen next. Because while Ethan and Vanessa believed they were planning my future, I now understood something they did not. William had already planned it years ago. I took a seat at the table and listened while Ethan explained his plans. He spoke with the confidence of someone who believed every major decision had already been made. Vanessa opened a notebook and began listing possibilities. One apartment complex, a retirement community, a condominium closer to town. They discussed square footage, monthly fees, and moving schedules as if I were not sitting directly across from them. What surprised me was not their lack of sensitivity. It was their certainty. Neither of them asked what I wanted. Neither of them asked whether I planned to leave. They simply assumed the outcome favored them. I folded my hands and remained quiet. The silence seemed to encourage them. Vanessa pointed to a brochure and said, "This place has excellent reviews. It would probably be easier for you than maintaining a large house." I looked at the photograph hanging above the fireplace. William had installed that frame himself years ago. The image showed our family gathered during Thanksgiving. Everyone smiling. Everyone appearing connected. Looking at it now felt almost surreal. Ethan continued speaking. "The sooner we handle everything, the smoother the transition will be." Transition. Another carefully chosen word. Similar to practical. Similar to realistic. Words designed to soften decisions that were already made. I glanced at the folder I had brought home from Michael's office. It rested beside my chair. Neither Ethan nor Vanessa seemed interested in it. That told me something important. They believed there was nothing inside worth discussing. After nearly 30 minutes, Ethan finally paused. "What do you think?" he asked. I looked at him calmly. "I think there are still documents that need to be reviewed." For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed his face. It lasted only a moment before disappearing. "The estate process can take a while," he said. "That should not affect the bigger picture." I almost smiled. He still believed he understood the bigger picture. The next several days revealed even more. Ethan began making calls about contractors. Vanessa discussed possible renovations. At one point, I overheard a conversation about repainting the kitchen. The same kitchen where William and I spent countless mornings drinking coffee together. They were making plans for a future they did not yet control. Through all of it, I remained polite. I did not argue. I did not reveal what Michael had shown me. Instead, I watched. And the more I watched, the more confident they became. Then Michael called again. This time, his message was brief. A formal document review had been scheduled for the following week. All relevant parties would be present. Certain agreements would be presented and discussed. His tone remained professional, but I sensed something beneath it. Anticipation. When I informed Ethan and Vanessa about the meeting, they seemed pleased. Vanessa immediately assumed it would confirm everything they expected. Ethan even joked that perhaps we would finally put all the paperwork behind us. I nodded and said very little. That evening, after they left, I sat alone in the living room. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. Outside, the wind moved gently through the maple tree William and I planted years ago. I thought about the envelope. I thought about his letter. Most of all, I thought about the promise he made long before any of this happened. "You will never have to worry, Evelyn." For days, those words had echoed in my mind. Now they felt different, stronger. The meeting was only a few days away. Ethan and Vanessa believed they were walking toward confirmation. I knew they were walking toward information they had never expected to hear. And for the first time since William's passing, I felt completely calm. The morning of the document review arrived with clear blue skies and unusually warm weather for early spring. I woke before my alarm and sat quietly at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The house felt peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I was not overwhelmed by uncertainty. I was simply waiting. By 10 o'clock, I was seated in Michael Harrison's conference room. The same large window overlooked the town green. The same polished table reflected the sunlight. One by one, everyone arrived. Ethan entered. First, he looked confident and relaxed. Vanessa followed a few minutes later carrying a notebook. Both greeted me politely. Neither seemed concerned. In fact, they appeared almost eager to begin. Michael entered last. He carried several folders and placed them neatly on the table. After everyone settled into their seats, he began reviewing the agenda. His tone remained calm and professional. The first documents covered routine matters: financial accounts, administrative filings, standard estate procedures. Ethan and Vanessa listened comfortably. Occasionally, they exchanged glances that suggested everything was unfolding exactly as expected. I remained silent. Then Michael opened a different folder. The atmosphere in the room shifted almost immediately. "The next matter concerns agreements executed prior to William Parker's marriage," he said. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair. Vanessa looked up from her notes. Michael continued. "Specifically, a prenuptial agreement that remained active and enforceable throughout the marriage." The room became very quiet. I watched Ethan's expression carefully. He appeared surprised, but not concerned. Not yet. Michael began reading relevant sections. The language was formal, but the meaning was unmistakable. Certain assets were protected. Certain ownership rights were clearly defined. Certain decisions had already been made decades earlier. Ethan frowned. Vanessa stopped writing. Michael continued turning pages. Each clause added another layer of clarity. Every paragraph reinforced William's intentions. Every signature confirmed those intentions had been reviewed and legally validated. The confidence I had seen in Ethan and Vanessa slowly began to fade. Questions started appearing. Then more questions followed. Michael answered each one by pointing directly to the agreement. Dates, signatures, witnesses, amendments. Everything had been preserved. Everything had been documented. At one point, Ethan leaned forward. "Are you saying these provisions are still controlling?" Michael met his gaze calmly. "Yes, they are." Silence followed. The kind of silence that settles over a room when assumptions begin to collapse. Vanessa flipped through several pages placed in front of her. The speed of her movements increased with every section she reviewed. I remembered the brochures, the conversations about renovations, the discussions about moving schedules. None of those plans seemed very important anymore. Michael then presented additional supporting documents that William had updated over the years. Each one reinforced the same message. Nothing had been left to chance. Nothing depended on interpretation. William had anticipated potential confusion and addressed it long before any of us sat in that room. As the meeting continued, I found myself thinking less about legal language and more about William himself. This was exactly how he approached problems. Carefully, thoroughly, quietly. He never enjoyed conflict, but he believed preparation prevented it. Looking around the table, I realized I was witnessing the result of that preparation. The confidence Ethan and Vanessa carried into the room had disappeared entirely. In its place was uncertainty, and the meeting was not over yet. Michael closed one folder and reached for another. The next documents, he explained, addressed rights and protections that would become even more important. As he opened the file, I noticed Ethan and Vanessa sitting completely still. For the first time since William's passing, they were no longer planning the future. They were finally learning what William had already planned for them. Michael opened the final folder and adjusted the documents in front of him. The room was silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody reached for a notebook. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed distant. Then Michael began reading the sections that William had considered most important. The language was direct. The house belonged to me, not temporarily, not conditionally. The right to live there, control it, and make decisions regarding it rested entirely with me. Additional provisions protected financial accounts, investment income, and several assets that William had specifically designated for my security and independence. Every statement was supported by signatures, witnesses, and years of careful updates. Ethan stared at the documents in front of him. Vanessa read the same page twice before looking up. Neither seemed able to reconcile what they were hearing with what they had expected. Michael continued explaining the structure William had established. Certain inheritance distributions existed, but they were tied to specific conditions and timelines. More importantly, William had included language discouraging attempts to pressure, remove, or interfere with my living arrangements. It was as though he had anticipated the exact situation unfolding in that room. When Michael finally finished, the silence returned. This time it felt different. Heavy. Permanent. Ethan was the first to speak. His voice lacked the confidence I had heard for weeks. Dad never mentioned any of this. Michael nodded calmly. William believed his written instructions would speak for themselves when necessary. No one argued with that. There was nothing to argue about. The documents were clear. The decisions had already been made years earlier. Eventually, the meeting concluded. Papers were gathered. Chairs moved quietly across the floor. Vanessa left first. Ethan followed shortly afterward. Neither looked angry. They looked stunned. I watched them walk away and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Just clarity. For weeks I had imagined that this moment might feel like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of confusion. William had not defeated anyone. He had simply protected what mattered to him. After everyone left, I remained in the conference room for a few minutes. Michael closed the last folder and offered a small smile. "He loved you very much," he said. I looked down at the documents. I know. Those 3 words carried more meaning than anything else I could have said. The drive home felt different from every drive I had taken since the funeral. The roads were familiar. The town was familiar. Yet something inside me had changed. For the first time, I was not focused on what I had lost. I was focused on what remained. When I pulled into the driveway, the maple tree swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. I stood for a moment before walking inside. The house greeted me with the same quiet comfort it always had. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee. William's favorite chair still sat near the living room window. Everything felt peaceful. I walked slowly through each room, not because I needed to inspect anything, because I wanted to appreciate it. This home was never just wood, stone, and paint. It was 28 years of shared mornings, family dinners, holiday traditions, and ordinary moments that became extraordinary because we lived them together. That evening, I sat on the back porch and watched the sun begin to set behind the trees. The sky turned gold, then orange, then soft shades of pink. I thought about William's promise, the one he made years ago, the one I finally understood completely. He had kept it. Even after he was gone, he had kept it. And as the last light faded across the yard we built together, I realized something simple but important. Some people believed they could decide my future for me. William made certain they never could.